If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast and do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love.
Good morning, friends. So we are continuing our series on For the Common Good, and you may remember the line For the Common Good comes from 1 Corinthians 12:7, where Paul says, "To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good." And we talked, when we began this series, we talked about how God has given every single one of us gifts that we are to use for the common good. And then last week, Maria talked about the body of Christ and how we are all a part of the body of Christ together. And our gifts, the gifts that we are given, are most effective when we use them together as the body of Christ, when we share them together as the body of Christ. Well, today Paul is talking to us about love, and I don't know if you remember this, but at the end of chapter 12, Paul introduces chapter 13 with this line. He says, "I will show you a still more excellent way." And the more excellent way is, of course, the gift of love. Now, speaking of the gift of love, I have to tell you the story that a seminary colleague shared with us in our advanced preaching class several years ago. I still remember this story because it's kind of funny and sad all at the same time. But apparently, his grandparents lived in just east of Dallas. I can't remember if it was Garland or Mesquite or Terrell or what, but they lived east of Dallas. And he told the story of going to visit them one day. But let me kind of lay the groundwork for the story. Apparently, his grandparents really struggled to make enough money to raise 4 kids and to do all the things, provide for them in all the ways that they needed to provide for them. And so when it came time to retire, his grandmother and his grandfather decided they knew what they were going to do in retirement. His grandfather bought a big recliner and propped it in the living room right in front of the television so he could watch the Texas Rangers games. And his grandmother, according to my friend, she became the queen of bingo. Turns out that she would go to a bingo game Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, And I can't remember why, but she skipped Thursday night, and oftentimes she would go to play bingo on Friday night as well. And it was a place where she'd kind of keep up with her friends. It's kind of like people who play bunco or mahjong or any of those games that bring folks together. And so she would go and play bingo. And that's kind of what they did in retirement. He would watch the Rangers, and she would play bingo. Well, everything was going well until there came a time when his grandfather had a series of strokes. And this series of strokes left him paralyzed on the left side of his body. He could not speak, he could not swallow, he could not move the left side of his body. And so as the doctors were talking to his grandfather and his grandmother in the hospital, they were saying to them that they were going to need to move him into a nursing home. And his grandmother said, "We won't have anything like that." She said, I will learn how to take care of him. And by that point, they had inserted a feeding tube in his stomach, and so she even had to learn how to feed him through the feeding tube in his stomach. My friends reminded us that back then the stuff that they would feed in the feeding tube at that point was green for some reason, and so the grandkids called it the green goop, the green goop. And so the reason I'm telling you all this is because one day he came to class and told us this story of having visited his grandparents the week before, and there in the small house there east of Dallas was instead of a recliner in the living room, there was a hospital bed in the living room, and he could still watch television, but everything that his grandmother had to take care of everything. And so he told the story of going to the house and opening the door. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where as soon as you walk into the room, you know something is not right. You ever been in a situation like that? You don't quite know what it is, but you know something is going wrong. And his eyes are kind of getting used to the darker inside the room light, and eventually he realizes what it is. His grandfather is using the one arm that works and making all kinds of motions. His grandfather has a red face, and he sees his grandmother crying. And then he realizes what's going on. The green goop is all over the bed. It is all over his grandfather. And as some of us in our 20s would do back then, he begins to back up. He begins to figure out a way to leave the room without disturbing anything and just let himself out of the house. His grandmother had not noticed him yet, but he grabs the screen door, and he forgot that the screen door squeaks. And as soon as the screen door squeaks, his grandmother looks around, and she looks at him, and she says, "Don't you leave. Don't you leave. Don't you dare leave." Sometimes love looks like this. Don't you dare leave. Sometimes love looks like this. I'll have to admit, it is a whole lot easier talking about love when I can tell you stories of young parents holding a baby for the very first time. All right? It's a lot easier to talk about love when I can talk about a young couple coming to say their vows to one another in the sanctuary and being married and all of that. It's a lot easier to talk about love when we tell those kinds of stories. It's a lot easier to talk about love when I went to the hospital this past week to visit a couple of our church members who were in the hospital. And one of the things that I found when I was there is not only the church members who were in the hospital, but also their spouses sitting there right beside them in the room. It's a lot easier to talk about that kind of love. It's a lot easier to talk about the kind of love that Gene and Pat Calvert had for each other. Gene and Pat had the privilege of doing the memorial service for Gene just a couple of weeks ago. Their son Robert called me up a week prior to that and said, "Dad died unexpectedly in his sleep. Will, would you be willing to do the service?" Absolutely. Gene and Pat had been married for 73 years. 73 years. That's a long time, friends. And I still remember one of the last times that I saw them, they were walking hand in hand. And they were walking hand in hand not because they were trying to hold each other up, even though they were in their 90s. They were walking hand in hand because they still loved each other. They were walking hand in hand for that reason. But I have to tell you, those little babies that you hold in your hand for the very first time, they grow up, don't they? They grow up. And sometimes, some of you may have experienced this. Sometime you may have this experience in the middle of the night where that little baby that was so nice and precious is throwing up or has a fever. And what do? You go and take care of your kid. Or maybe that child turns out to get involved in some stuff or do some things that are far beyond what you expected of that child. Maybe in high school, you had a 10 o'clock curfew on school nights, and at 11:35, you're still waiting for that child to show up and wondering where he or she is. Loving another human being is sometimes pretty tough work. Sometimes you forgive, and you forgive, and you forgive, and you forgive. It is easy to love when life is pretty, when life is lovely, when life is like that little baby, that brand new baby. We have a 2-month-old in church today, brand new. It's easy to love in those situations. But love does not always look like that, does it? All of us can think of those moments in our lives when love didn't look quite that precious and quite that beautiful. Those moments when life is tough. Well, Paul talks to us about love. In 1 Corinthians 13, let me share with you again these words from verses 4 through 7. Paul says to us, love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. Love does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. I have to admit, when I read those words, I kind of cringe a little bit. The reason why is, friends, my love has not been that way all the way along life's journey. There have been times when I have not been patient. Perhaps the same for you. There have been times when I have not been kind. There have been times when I have been envious. There have been times when I have been boastful or arrogant or rude. There have been times when I insisted on my own way. And my hunch is that if you think about your life, there have been times in your life when you have done some of those things as well. Paul is telling us to love one another as Christ loves us. I don't know if you noticed the gospel lesson. The gospel lesson tells the story of Jesus after Jesus had stood up, as Maria reminded us, and read the scroll from Isaiah where Jesus is called to bring justice and mercy, to lift up the downtrodden and raise up the poor. And yet, Jesus is from Nazareth, and the people in Jesus' hometown, they can't hear a word that he is saying because they remember when he was the one who skinned his knee while playing out with the rest of the kids. They remember when Mary and Joseph corrected him for doing something that he should not have done. They remember the things that he said as they were playing one day. And yet this Jesus is the one that tells us to love God and to love others. Yes, this Jesus is the one. This Jesus is also the one who went to a cross and died. Friends, when love breaks our hearts, we need to remember what love looks like. Sometimes love is really different looking. Sometimes love looks like green goop. Sometimes love looks like staying up in the middle of the night and cleaning up a kid who has a stomach virus. Sometimes love looks like all kinds of things that some of you can remember in your own minds, things that you have done to love another. Friends, when I came to be the pastor here at First United Methodist Church, Pasadena, a number of my friends would say to me, well, Will, what church is it that you're going to be the pastor of? And I would say the First Methodist Church, the one there on Fairmont Parkway. And they would say, oh, yeah, the Copper Top Church. The Copper Top Church. Well, friends, the church, we are the church. The church is not a building. The church is not a building. And my hope and prayer for us as the people of God called First United Methodist Church Pasadena is that we will not be known as the Copper Top Church, but that we will be known as the people of God who love others in profound and meaningful ways. And sometimes love those that are unlovable to the rest of the world. Let me offer you just two simple ways that you can begin to practice that. A couple summers ago, when we went to see the eclipse in Kansas, we were in Kansas City, Missouri, and we went to visit the Church of the Resurrection, which is the largest United Methodist church in the nation, a church of about 30,000 members. They run 9,000 to 10,000 people on a weekend in worship, and the worship service that we went to probably had 2,000 to 3,000 people in it. But yet, Karen and I experienced that worship service, as I've shared with you before, as very intimate and very personal. And it was like going to a small church, even though we were sitting there with 2,000 to 3,000 people. And the reason why is that there was a woman who was the section leader of the area that we were sitting in. And she greeted us, she learned our name, she found out some things about us, she introduced us to other people around her. And we felt like we were a part of something very special, a very small, intimate fellowship of people. You may not know it, but in many of you, in some of the sections that you're sitting in, even today, there are people who are sitting there who are assigned section leaders of your area. This section, this section, this section, this section, and so forth. And those section leaders have that same responsibility. But here's what I want to do today. I want to appoint every single one of you in this room as assistant section leaders. Okay? I'm appointing every single one of you in this room as assistant section leaders. And your job from this day on is to greet the people sitting around you, to welcome the people sitting around you, and if you don't know someone, you've never seen them before, to introduce yourself to them so that you can know their name and they can know your name, and you can be aware of when when they are missing the next Sunday that they are not here. Here's another thing. Our ushers are going to be passing among you some little cards, and ushers, this is your signal to pass out some little cards that look like this. There's a side that's in English, there's a side that's in Spanish, and these are random acts of kindness cards. We've been talking about this a little bit over the past several weeks, but I invite you as a member of this church to do something this week that is a random act of kindness. There's some detailed instructions about that in your bulletin today, but I invite you to take one of these cards and to do something this week that is a random act of kindness. And here's what I invite you to also do. I invite you to really be bold, and I invite you, the ushers are going to give you one of these, but I invite some of you to go and pick up some more of these and do several random acts of kindness. In fact, if you do 3 or more random acts of kindness this week, I invite you to do at least one of those for someone that in your humanness you might think to yourself, this person really doesn't deserve this. Because you know what? That's the way Christ's love is. Christ loves us sometimes even when we do not deserve it. And we know when those times are. And yet Christ loves us and forgives us and welcomes us into His kingdom. So friends, I invite you to take a random act of kindness card, pick up some more if you feel bold, and share the love of Christ in your everyday life this week.